Got a review here for the classic war film, Tora, Tora, Tora. This is part of my June DVD talk, Historical Appreciation Month. This is one of the greatest war films of all time, certainly top 5. And I have a personal affection for this one that maybe it might be my number one. It'd be tough to. I think it's first among a lot of equals. It's one of the most interesting war films in that its depiction of events up to that disastrous December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. It does a great job of accurately and fairly depicting the circumstances for both sides that led up to those events of December 7th. Well done, very, very mature film. Daryl Zanuck was the producer, and he came off of The Longest Day with Fox needing to produce something to get them back in the black, because Fox was having a disastrous time. They've lost a bunch of money on like Dr. Dolittle and I think My Fair Lady, and they were having a terrible time financially. They put $25 million into this film, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful film. It's a long film, 225 minutes. There's a Japanese cut of this film, and in the U.S. cut, the run time's about the same, but the film goes back and forth. Basically starts off with what really precipitated all of this, which was the belligerent Japanese at this point were attacking China, Indochina, and the U.S. Applied a trade embargo on Japan, which kind of choked off their ability to get resources easily. And that trade embargo really precipitated the Japanese attack. The Japanese was at a war footing, expansionist war footing, and they needed every bit of resources they could get. And that embargo started it all. The events as they led up to it, both sides, is just fascinating stuff to watch. You see one side, which is the Japanese, absolutely in a war footing. The entire organization, militarily and government-wise, focused on one goal: conquer and expansion. The other side is the U.S. side. Unfortunately, at that time, was I would say lackadaisical and comfortable. It was like a big sleepy bear that the bear, you nudge the bear a little bit and it doesn't really move. I think at this point too, you had a lot of countries, U.S. in particular, that was tired of war, quite frankly. I mean, you got to remember, World War I was a disastrous the human loss associated with World War I had to have had a dramatic effect on people's moods and desires at that time. And then secondly, the U.S. was all their talent, if you will, was focused on industry. All the great minds and talent really weren't in the military. Conversely, you got the Japanese with their mentality at that point. Their best and brightest minds were in the Navy and the Army. And so they were watching that mindset and the thought process and the mental chess game that went on for really it started, I guess, November and maybe a little bit earlier in terms of the communication and the thinking that would lead up to the Japanese sneak attack, December 7th. But it's portrayed in a way that I think is extremely fair to both sides. It's painful to watch as an American, I will admit that, because you've got I just couldn't I can't help thinking and attaching a bunch of analogies that are now comical in my life to how we in the military in the prior to the December 7th were operationally. It's almost like, to describe what I'm trying to say, is it would be almost like the pain that you feel when you have to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, or dealing with the government in general. It's painful. The bureaucracy, the red tape, the ineptitude. It's like entering a whole different world of just idiocy. And yeah, so watching our military as deal with all these clues that are not even subtle clues that the Japanese are going to attack us, and our responses to that were just it's painful to watch. Just as an American, it was painful to watch, and certainly. The December 7th, I think the loss of 3,000 American lives on our soil was something that we were certainly not used to. Contrast with, say, what the Russians experienced in World War II, or China, or anybody else. I mean, it's a whole different mindset when you are attacked on your own turf. But the fact is, we were just lackadaisical and never thought in our wildest dreams that we would be attacked, and particularly at Pearl Harbor, because the harbor is fairly shallow, and the whole thing was that torpedoes dropped at a height would be about 30 feet, would drop 30 feet below the shallowness of Pearl Harbor, and it just would be entirely ineffective. But what the Japanese did was put extra wings and things on the end of these torpedoes, and dropped them at a certain height, practiced with that one goal in mind, and were successful in just practically obliterating the Navy, the Pacific Navy at that time. All the clues that led up to us just missing it completely were just, you had most of the Admiralty were clearly given all these clues that we were going to be attacked, and they passed that stuff on. But what happened was, again, because of the mindset, I say it was the mindset at the time, and you have to look at talent, or the lack of talent at that time within the military, as opposed to, say, our industrial side. All those memos and telegrams and information that came from the higher ups about our state of readiness were either misinterpreted badly or ignored. It just ignored. The fatal attack, of course, occurred. The declaration of war by Japan came 1 hour after they'd already bombed us. So that's and that's highlighted quite. I mean, all of this from a historical perspective is about as accurately as researched as possible for this film. And I think the producers and the director were very careful. Fleischer, the director, was very careful to make sure that this thing was historically accurate for both sides. In fact, what they did was both governments looked at their parts of the film and essentially blessed off on it, so giving it an extra layer of validity. The Japanese side was initially filmed by legendary director Akira Kurosawa, but this was the first time that he had access to a non-Toho staff and non-Toho resources and a huge big budget to go with it. And although accounts of this vary, he apparently just kind of went into a mental collapse, and he had to be pulled from the film. When he got pulled from the film, he had only shot like 6 minutes of footage over 3 weeks, and it wasn't even usable footage. There was a story in this film that, Akira Kurosawa's attention to details is incredible, and some of the things that he would do apparently would be like there would be a room with a set of books, and the books wouldn't be the right exact books for that moment, or and he would have the shot stopped until they got the exact right books in the cabinet. Another was there's like a little prayer room that the Japanese had prior to the attack that it didn't have the right shade of white. And so they stopped and just repainted the room until they got the right shade of white for the scene. That's the kind of stuff that was going on, good, bad, or indifferent. And I think it probably made, and it did apparently make people like Daryl Zanuck pull their freaking hair out. So unfortunately, he got pulled and replaced. But the Japanese side, the directors did a fantastic job. So, it was not a loss from that perspective. The music of Jerry Goldsmith is some of the best war music I've ever heard. It's a fantastic piece. And I'll tell you, when you compare this film to the modern reboot, you compare this war footage, the last 40 minutes of the attack, this footage with that CGI fest, and hands down, I think this is easily a winner. It's a great film, and it's a long film, but I'll tell you what, it warrants multiple watches. I watched both cuts of the film and the director's commentary on the first film. This thing is loaded with special features, by the way. There's an hour and 90-minute documentary, and then there's multiple like movie tone back in the 40s. There's movie tone footage that the government had. In fact, there was a guy that filmed the attack, just happened to be there, filmed the attack, and then that's what ends up in those little movie tone newsreels that you see about the attack on Pearl Harbor. The other interesting tidbit, there's so many, I could talk about this for an hour, but the other interesting thing is that USS Arizona, one of the most famous scenes, historical scenes, is the tower of the USS Arizona collapsing under fire. They were unable to replicate that, mainly out of fear that they couldn't control the outcome of that crash. The other thing was there was a number of there was 2 fatalities associated with the making of this film, and some of the scenes you see with the airplanes that were stacked on the runway like idiots. We stacked them on the runway, worried about sabotage. At that time, you had like 150,000 Japanese people living in Hawaii, and so we're not concerned at all about being attacked or airstrike. The thought was if we're going to be attacked, there'd be some kind of sabotage, like a terrorist thing. So they stacked all the planes like idiots, and of course, they just were sitting ducks for the bombs. But at one point, so they were trying to depict some of the planes trying to get off the runway to fight the attack, and one of the planes was skidding and heading towards a crowd of staff or crew, and they had to blow the plane immediately. And you see the plane kind of going like this, and the propeller flying off of the thing and going in all kinds of directions, and all these guys running for their lives. That was apparently not planned. And, it's exciting stuff. Great film. Moving portrayal. Everybody in this. The interesting thing about this film as well is that it was purposely cast with non-stars. They wanted this thing to have a realism of its own, and some of the people in this film eventually went on to be stars, but at that time, most of the cast of this film were not stars per se. But yeah, if you're looking for a war film that I would highly recommend that you give consideration to watching Tora, Tora, Tora. So that'll wrap up my review, and hope you enjoyed it. Appreciate you watching.